You are not paranoid. You really did just watch a moment where the line between national interest and private profit didn't just blur, it vanished. For decades, Washington has been the architect of global sanctions, punishing dictators and corrupt oligarchs to protect the international order. But today, the tables have turned as America's closest allies, the European Union, Canada, and Australia, quietly treat the sitting president of the United States like the leader of a rogue state. As we approach the 250th anniversary of our nation declaring its independence from a king, we are forced to ask a terrifying question. What happens to American power when the leader of the free world starts to look like the people we used to sanction together? This special analysis follows a critical oversight hearing in Congress, where evidence of democratic backsliding in the United States moved from a quiet concern to a rapidly accelerating crisis. Our nation has remained on the list of global backsliding democracies for 5 years, and recent months have seen the administration move onto a collision course with the United States Constitution. The narrative being sold is simple. Maduro is an illegitimate dictator whose regime must be replaced. However, the reality behind the scenes suggests a coordination between the Trump-Vance administration and big oil companies over Venezuela's resources that was established long before the latest operation against Maduro. Rather than seeking congressional authorization, reports indicate that critical foreign policy decisions were made during private briefings with oil executives, bypassing traditional national security protocols. This pattern suggests a presidency that has begun to look less like a public office and more like a private revenue stream.
Ms. Perriman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening this hearing today. We've heard throughout the day about the horrific acts of January 6, 2021, and so today I'm going to focus on the aftermath and what we can all do to respond. In the months following January 6, 2021, the United States was added to a list of global backsliding democracies by the International Institute of Democracy and Electoral Assistance. And our nation has remained on that list every year since. That already concerning backslide has become accelerated and rapidly accelerated over the past 11 or so months as the president and his allies and this Congress have sought to govern in a way that is on a collision course with the United States Constitution. The president has sought to usurp the power of this Congress through impounding funds, through removing a head of state without notification or authorization from Congress, and blatantly dismantling agencies across the federal government that Congress has sought and created to serve people. The Department of Justice has become politicized, aiding and abetting the types of conduct that we saw on January 6th. And there are reports now of scores of cases where the Department of Justice is providing false and incorrect information to federal courts across the country. The president has sought to enrich himself and his friends and allies while people in this country have no health care and are struggling to make ends meet. The president and his allies in Congress are seeking to undermine the ability of people to vote in our free and fair election system. And all of this is happening while on a near daily basis, we at Democracy Forward and so many lawyers across the country are having to go to court every single day to defend the rights of people, whether under the First Amendment, the Due Process Clause, or the Equal Protection Clause of our Constitution from the president's attacks. The threats to our democracy that many of you experienced on January 6, 2021 are now on a national and global stage because of the president and his allies, approach to governing. And it is all the more ironic that this is happening on the 250th year where we will celebrate the anniversary of this country declaring its independence from a king.
While the American people struggle with rising costs and healthcare instability, federal agencies created to serve the public are reportedly being dismantled or politicized to aid the interests of the president's inner circle. From a neutral perspective, supporters argue that these aggressive moves are necessary to secure energy independence and remove a hostile actor like Maduro to protect Western interests. They view this as a bold application of America First diplomacy. However, critics and international allies are stunned by the lack of institutional guardrails. When Democratic allies start restricting intelligence sharing and freezing assets tied to a U.S. presidency, it is not merely a political snub, it is a survival move by partners who no longer believe Washington's institutions can restrain their own leader. As this investigation pulls back the curtain, we must examine the information gap between what is said on the public stage and what is happening in the desert files of secret agreements. The real danger is not just that America's global leadership is weakened, but that a presidency entangled with private business interests makes the entire alliance system appear unreliable. In the following parts of this series, we will walk through how the United States transitioned from being the world's chief sanctioner to being the target of sanctions by its own friends. What is the actual market value of a superpower's foreign policy? If the latest investigative reports are to be believed, that price tag was set at exactly $1 billion. We have moved past the era of traditional diplomacy and into a phase where the American presidency is treated as a high-stakes investment vehicle for global energy titans. The probe-launched headlines we see today are the direct result of a chopsteak dinner at Mar-a-Lago, where a specific, rapacious request was allegedly made. Give me $1 billion for the campaign and you'll get the energy policy you want. This wasn't merely a campaign promise. It was the birth of a coordinated plan to treat Venezuela's resources as private collateral. While the public is told a story of freedom on the march, the reality behind the scenes is a takeover so entangled with private money that it has pushed our closest democratic allies to a breaking point. The current administration is not just seeking to remove an illegitimate dictator, it is reportedly attempting to keep the Maduro apparatus in place while ensuring it remains compliant to the needs of big oil. This strategy ensures that foreign policy is no longer driven by the interests of the Venezuelan people or the American taxpayer, but by the specific corporations that funded the president's return to power. This level of unprecedented coordination has triggered a massive investigation into what many are calling a lawless presidency. The core of the legal crisis is the total lack of transparency. Critical briefings on the Venezuela operation did not take place in the Situation Room or with the Gang of Eight in Congress. Instead, decisions were allegedly made during private meetings with oil executives, bypassing every established constitutional guardrail. From a neutral perspective, some geopolitical analysts argue that this bold approach is the only way to secure energy sovereignty in a world where Russia and China are constantly expanding their influence in South America. They contend that energy security is the ultimate form of national defense. However, the legal counter-argument is stark. Engaging in the kidnapping of a foreign head of state and purporting to run their country through a shadow government is not only immoral, it is fundamentally unlawful under international law. Even world leaders who despise the Maduro regime are stunned, recognizing that this move breaks the very rules America once fought to protect. As we pull back the curtain on these desert files, we see a presidency that has stopped being a public office and started functioning as a private revenue stream. This institutional paralysis is why global partners are now treating Washington like a rogue regime, restricting intelligence sharing to protect themselves from an unreliable leader. In the next part of this investigation, we will dive into the Five Eyes fracture and why our allies believe the greatest threat to democracy is now sitting in the Oval Office. When America's closest allies begin holding back intelligence from Washington, it is not a mere diplomatic snub. It is a cold, calculated move for survival. For the first time in the post-war era, the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, the world's most elite information-sharing network, is facing a structural fracture that could permanently alter global security. This is not just about a disagreement over policy. It is about a total collapse of trust between the United States and its most loyal partners, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia. The reason behind this historic rift is deeply troubling. Our allies have quietly concluded that the American presidency itself has become a risk factor. There are mounting fears within the intelligence communities of London and Ottawa that highly classified information shared with Washington might be leaked or redirected, specifically towards adversaries like Russia. This anxiety is not based on speculation, but on a pattern of executive behavior that treats intelligence not as a national asset, but as a tool for personal leverage. For decades, the United States was the anchor of the democratic world and the trusted guardian of the rules-based order. However, the current administration's power grab in Venezuela, conducted with the coordination of big oil and without congressional oversight, has signaled to the world that America's internal guardrails are no longer functioning. Allies have watched as the Department of Justice became politicized and as critical national security decisions moved from the Situation Room to private tables at Mar-a-Lago. From a neutral standpoint, some argue that a president has the absolute right to control intelligence and that traditional bureaucratic hurdles only slow down necessary action. They believe that bypassing the established bureaucracy is essential for a truly independent foreign policy. Yet the counter-perspective from global leaders is that an unpredictable superpower is an unreliable one. If the institutions designed to restrain a leader, Congress and the courts, are seen as paralyzed, allies feel they have no choice but to protect themselves from Washington rather than collaborate with it. This fracture in the Five Eyes represents a vote of no confidence in the stability of the American system. When Canada or Australia decides that it is safer to keep secrets from the U.S. president than to share them, the entire foundation of Western security is shaken. The real question we face today is not just whether the alliance can survive this presidency, but whether the idea of America as a trusted leader can ever be restored. In the next part of our series, we will examine the economic fallout of this crisis and how global markets are reacting to a presidency under investigation. While the political world is fixated on the drama of the power grab in Venezuela, the most significant verdict is being delivered in the silent, cold halls of global finance. Money, unlike politicians, does not care about slogans or freedom on the march. Money only cares about stability, and right now the American presidency is projecting the exact opposite. Wall Street is currently grappling with a terrifying new reality. The US dollar, long the world's untouchable reserve currency, is being tethered to the private business deals of a single administration. The information gap we've discussed isn't just a political problem, it's a market-killing liability. When reports surfaced that a $500 million to $1 billion investment from big oil could dictate the energy policy of the world's largest superpower, the institutional trust that backs the U.S. financial system began to erode. Investors aren't panicking because they love the Maduro regime. They are panicking because they no longer know where the U.S. government ends and private corporate interests begin. For the first time, we are seeing geopolitical risk being assigned not to a foreign conflict, but to the American executive branch itself. If the United States can kidnap a foreign head of state and install a shadow government based on private oil briefings, bypassing Congress and the traditional national security apparatus, then no international contract or treaty is truly safe. This is why we are seeing a quiet but steady de-risking strategy from global funds. They are asking, if the rules can be rewritten at Mar-a-Lago for $1 billion, what stops them from being rewritten against our assets tomorrow? From a neutral perspective, some market optimists argue that this aggressive takeover will lead to a golden era of cheap energy. They believe that by forcing the Maduro apparatus to play ball with big oil, the administration is securing the resources necessary to lower inflation and boost U.S. industrial capacity. This energy realism views the cost of breaking international law as a small price to pay for domestic prosperity. However, the counter-argument from economists is far more grim. The strength of the U.S. dollar is built on the rule of law and predictable institutions. When the Department of Justice is seen as aiding and abetting lawless actions, the dollar loses its status as a safe haven. We are now witnessing allies and even some enemies exploring alternative payment systems to bypass a Washington that they now view as an unpredictable, rogue actor. As the probe-launched headlines continue to reveal layers of corruption and secret briefings, the economic verdict is becoming clear. A presidency that functions as a private revenue stream is a threat to the global financial order. In the next part of this investigation, we will look at the purge within the civil service, how the professional experts meant to guard these institutions are being systematically removed to make way for the loyalists. Imagine a fortress where the guards are not looking outward at the enemy, but are being systematically escorted out the back door by the very commander they were sworn to serve.
But yet there is another part of this story that we have been honored at Democracy Forward to see every single day in communities across the country. And that is, as powerful institutions have pulled back or decided they're going to sit on the sidelines and succumb to the president's intimidation tactics, we have seen the American people all across the country step forward. As the president and his allies tried to intimidate Americans for peacefully using their voices in protest of this administration's excesses, as he tried to intimidate people for peacefully declaring the most American slogan I can think of, "No Kings," millions of people took to the streets in the largest peaceful mobilization of United States citizens in this country's history last year, unintimidated by the president. It's a stroke of dark irony that as this president would pardon violent rioters and insurrections, he would have the audacity to call the American people across this country un-American for saying something like "No Kings." Over the past 11 months, there have been more than 500 federal court cases filed by people in communities, attorneys general, and members of civil society across this country seeking to defend people's rights. And the people are winning. They're winning in courts with judges that were appointed by President Trump himself, judges appointed by Republican presidents, and judges appointed by Democratic presidents.
This is the silent reality of the internal purge currently sweeping through Washington's most vital institutions. We are not just talking about political appointees changing with the seasons. We are witnessing the systematic removal of career civil servants, the environmental scientists, and the veteran prosecutors who represent the last line of defense against absolute executive overreach. As the takeover of Venezuela's oil wealth accelerates, the greatest obstacle to this billion-dollar deal is not the Maduro regime. It is the internal guardrails of the American government itself. Those guardrails are now being dismantled in real time. The Department of Justice, once the gold standard of independent law enforcement, has reportedly become politicized to an extent that has alarmed even the most seasoned legal experts. We are seeing reports of scores of cases where the DOJ is allegedly providing false or incorrect information to federal courts across the country. This is not a simple administrative error. It is a fundamental breakdown of the rule of law designed to aid and abet the administration's specific foreign policy goals. When the machinery of justice is repurposed to serve as a legal shield for private energy interests, the concept of a government for the people begins to dissolve. This dismantling extends far beyond the DOJ. Federal agencies created by Congress to serve the public and regulate industry are being hollowed out. The strategy appears to be a collision course with the United States Constitution, impounding funds authorized by Congress and removing officials without notification or legal authorization. The goal is clear: to ensure that when the big oil titans sit down at the table to divide Venezuela's resources, there are no career professionals left in the room to say this is illegal. From a neutral perspective, proponents of these moves argue that the federal bureaucracy has become a deep state that actively thwarts the will of the voters and the efficiency of the executive branch. They contend that a president must have the power to fire anyone who does not align with their agenda to ensure the government functions as a unified force. To them, this is about restoring accountability to the person the people actually elected. However, the counter-argument is that this is the final stage of a power grab. By replacing experts with loyalists, the administration removes the stress test that every major policy should undergo. Without these internal checks, the line between national strategy and personal enrichment vanishes. As we approach the 250th anniversary of American independence, we must ask if we are watching the birth of a new kind of monarchy, where loyalty to the leader outweighs loyalty to the law. In the next part of this investigation, we will look at the human cost of this takeover, the workers and citizens whose lives are being traded for oil and influence. What happens when the forgotten workers become mere pawns in a high-stakes poker game played by billionaires? We often hear about billion-dollar figures and oil deals struck at Mar-a-Lago, but there is a brutal truth hidden behind the glossy headlines: the actual cost paid by ordinary families. You may believe you are supporting an America First policy, but when the curtain is pulled back, you see that steel workers in Canada and middle-class families in the United States are being turned into collateral for the rise of a new corporate autocracy. Look at the reality unfolding at our northern border. While the administration focuses on seizing Venezuela's resource wealth, it is simultaneously triggering trade wars that send shockwaves through the continent. Foreign Minister Melanie Joly's recent emotional display during a press conference was not just a moment of diplomatic frustration, it was a fire alarm for thousands of steelworkers facing job losses due to sudden 50% tariffs. This is the information gap we must analyze. A policy marketed as protecting sovereignty is actually dismantling decades-old supply chains and leaving laborers in a state of total instability. Meanwhile, in Venezuela, the narrative of liberation is being twisted. Instead of bringing democracy, investigative reports suggest a coordinated effort to keep the Maduro apparatus functional, but under the direct control of big oil titans. The Venezuelan people, who have already endured impoverishment under a dictatorship, now face the risk of becoming the private property of energy moguls backed by Washington. This is not freedom, it is the transfer of resource ownership from one dictator to a consortium of special interests. Yet, amid the darkness of this executive overreach, a powerful wave of resistance is rising from civil society. Skye Perryman from Democracy Forward has pointed out that while large institutions may sit on the sidelines out of fear, the American people are stepping forward. With over 500 federal lawsuits filed in the last 11 months, lawyers, state attorneys general, and civil organizations are fighting every day in court to defend the rights of citizens. They are proving that even if an administration tries to buy policy with oil money, the Constitution remains the final unbreakable barrier. From a neutral perspective, proponents of this policy argue that the price for cheap energy and resource independence is necessary. They believe that in a brutal geopolitical world, might makes right, and securing oil is the best way to protect the American economy in the long run. However, public policy analysts ask the opposite. Can an economy truly be sustainable when it is built on the betrayal of closest allies and the erosion of its own citizens' rights? When trust in the system is lost, no amount of oil can compensate for the collapse of a democratic society. We are approaching the 250th anniversary of independence, but instead of celebrating liberty, millions are worrying about their jobs, their taxes, and a system that is rapidly losing its checks and balances. In the next part, we will dive into the secrets found in the leaked memos regarding the rift between the British monarchy and the government over these oil deals. The special relationship between Washington and London has survived world wars, the Cold War, and decades of economic shifts, but today it is facing a threat that no diplomat ever anticipated. A leaked memo that reveals a fundamental fracture in the Western alliance. We are no longer just looking at a disagreement over policy. We are witnessing a constitutional crisis that has crossed the Atlantic and landed squarely in the halls of Westminster. While the world watches the power grab in Venezuela, a secret struggle is unfolding between the British government and a presidency that seems increasingly willing to ignore the very rules of international law that Britain is sworn to uphold. The center of this storm is a leaked internal memo from Downing Street that has sent shockwaves through the diplomatic community. According to reports, the memo documents a sharp and unprecedented dissent from Prime Minister Keir Starmer's government regarding the Trump administration's coordination with big oil titans to bypass international treaties. The memo suggests that the British government was not only kept in the dark about the kidnapping of a foreign head of state, but was actively misled about the nature of the energy deals being struck. This is not just a breakdown in communication, it is a breakdown of the trust that allows the Five Eyes and NATO to function. This crisis has even reached the British monarchy, creating a unique constitutional stress test. There are whispers of a royal memo involving Prince William and his concern over the misuse of the royal prerogative in foreign affairs. The tension arises from a core conflict, a British government that must adhere to strict constitutional limits and international law, facing an American executive branch that is reportedly operating through private agreements at Mar-a-Lago. When a president treats foreign policy like a private business acquisition, it forces allies to choose between their historical partnership with Washington and their own commitment to the rule of law. From a neutral perspective, some analysts in the U.S. argue that the British government is being overly legalistic and slow to react to the realities of a new energy era. They contend that the U.S. is taking the necessary risks to stabilize the global oil market, and that allies should simply get in line behind the leader of the free world. In their view, bold leadership requires breaking a few old rules to build a more secure future for Western energy dominance. However, the legal perspective from London is far more cautious. British constitutional experts point out that if the U.S. presidency is allowed to function as a private revenue stream for oil corporations, the entire concept of a rules-based order disappears. If Washington can rewrite the rules of sovereignty for Venezuela today, there is no guarantee they won't do the same to a European or Commonwealth partner tomorrow. The leaked memos are a desperate attempt by career diplomats and constitutional guardians to signal to the world that the guardrails are failing. As we pull back the curtain on this diplomatic fallout, we see that the greatest damage isn't just the loss of oil or money, it is the loss of the collective defense that has kept the world stable for 80 years. In the final part of our series, we will examine the endgame. What happens when the investigation meets the resistance, and who will ultimately hold the power in this new American kleptocracy? We have reached the point of no return where the investigation meets the reality of political survival. The power grab in Venezuela was never just about oil. It was a stress test for the American experiment. And as we stand 10 months away from the midterm elections, the results of that test are finally coming into view. The 250th anniversary of the United States was supposed to be a celebration of independence from a king, but instead, it has become a struggle to define whether the presidency is a public trust or a private asset. The headlines regarding the probe into Trump and big oil are no longer just news. They are the opening arguments in what could be the most significant accountability movement in modern history. The accountability process has already begun, not in the halls of a gridlocked Congress, but in the federal courts through the relentless use of the Freedom of Information Act. These secret energy briefings and private agreements are being forced into the light, revealing a pattern where foreign policy was allegedly sold to the highest bidder. When a government attempts to cover up the kidnapping of a foreign leader or the privatization of national resources, it creates a point of vulnerability that no amount of misinformation can hide. The American people, despite the intimidation and the politicization of the Department of Justice, are responding with a historic mobilization. We are seeing a resurgence of the idea of democracy, not just as a political party, but as a collective demand for the rule of law. From a neutral perspective, some observers argue that this era represents a necessary creative destruction of old, inefficient diplomatic norms. They suggest that in a world of rising autocracies, America needed a leader who could act decisively and prioritize resource security above all else. To them, the endgame is a stronger, more energy-independent nation that isn't afraid to use its power. However, the institutional verdict is far more sobering. If the presidency can bypass Congress, dismantle the civil service, and trade policy for campaign donations, the America First slogan becomes a hollow shield for a kleptocratic takeover. The final resolution lies in the hands of the voters and the 5 non-negotiable truths of democracy. free and fair elections, equality, due process, personal freedom, and the rule of law. This is the 250 pledge that is now circulating through communities, a demand that anyone running for office must stand behind these core principles or lose the right to lead. As the probe into Venezuela reaches its climax, we are forced to decide what kind of country we want to be for the next 250 years. Will we be a nation of laws or a nation of kings? The curtain has been pulled back, the evidence is on the table, and the final verdict belongs to you.